And if you're going to listen to music, it's going to be inside because most likely you're going to be drinking when you're listening to it. So that created kind of the next developmental stage of jazz as a result of the diaspora of jazz musicians and prohibition and all these guys moving into the Northeast or up north where they had access to these instruments. So now you have a jazz band indoors playing, a more modern, danceful, popular version of jazz that was played in New Orleans, and you can have a piano in the rhythm section. There's no more need for marching drums, so you have the beginning of drum kits where one drummer will sit and play. The tuba, which played the marching bass lines, is now replaceable with an upright orchestral style bass. Clarinets don't have to be metal anymore. They can be, finer European wooden instruments. So the timbre of jazz changed when they moved into that environment also. And of course, again, no offense to banjo players, but when you put all those finer instruments in a band, banjo no longer has any place there because it sounds like a banjo. So in 1922, a new style of jazz guitar was introduced by Gibson Guitars. There was an engineer that worked there named Lloyd Lohr, and so he redesigned the flat top instrument specifically in order to project in this new art form as a rhythm instrument that could be heard in an orchestral setting. So obviously kept the 6 strings, kept the basic shape of the guitar, close enough for jazz, kept the basic shape of the guitar. He added violin-style sound holes. He added a violin-style floating bridge and a trapeze or violin-style tailpiece. And he changed the architecture of the top so now, if you looked at the guitar beginning in 1922, the top is arched like a violin and the back is arched like a violin or cello. The bridge sits on the pinnacle of the arch. An arch is a very strong architectural shape, so it can take downward pressure, as everybody knows. And the violin-style tailpiece sits above the top, so it doesn't impede the top from vibrating. So beginning in 1922, when you strung up a guitar that's designed by Lloyd Lohr, now when you put tension on the strings, it's pushing down on the top instead of pull up on the top. There's no longer a need for the bridge to be glued. It floats in place, and the tailpiece can be held in place by tension from the strings as long as it's anchored to the end pin the same way a violin is. So the result is you play a note on this, and now as energy is driven into the top, this relatively thin piece of wood, because it's arched, can accept that energy and vibrate up and down, pushing air into the body of the instrument, and then reflecting off of denser woods. In almost every case, traditional violin woods of maple, back, sides, and neck, and a spruce top, something that's thin and light and really stiff and strong. And so it vibrates back out through the opposing sound holes, and there's a reason for the design and the size that gives strength to the top but allow the volume of air to escape back to the audience. And for the first time, acoustically, you now have the ability to project through an orchestra, at least playing rhythm, using one of these new instruments. Now there were other archtop instruments before Lloyd Lohr designed the very first L5, which he built in 1922 and released in 1923. Orville Gibson had been experimenting with archtop guitars with oval holes that were a little bit more harp-like than they were They were just not designed to be orchestral. He was just trying to make them louder. And coinciding with the development of this instrument was a whole family of instruments Louis Lohr had designed, including the L5 guitar, the F5 mandolin, the M5 mandocello. These were all arched violin style instruments designed to be able to project out towards an audience. In the late teens, there was the most popular instrument in the United States was a mandolin. There were huge mandolin orchestras. While the men were off serving in World War I, women gravitated towards community bands playing mandolins. When the war ended, men came back, and the Roaring Twenties got started. The mandolin very quickly went out of style, and the women ended a lot of their participation in these community orchestras. So what Louis Lohr was trying to do for Gibson was make a better, more expensive, more projected mandolin, or family of mandolins, to revive these mandolin orchestras in the early 20s. And of course it failed. Mandolins went out of style, and the guitar took over as the preferred instrument, mostly male-driven. And because of jazz, now this style of instrument became a predominant instrument for professional musicians. Folk musicians still played flat top, parlor style instruments. So any questions about any of this so far? So that's the early development, 1922, L5 comes out, a bunch of people start copying that. D'Angelico starts making them, Stromberg, Epistephalopoulos starts making them with what became the Epiphone brand. There were a lot of guys that were copying what Gibson did. Gibson was sort of the first pioneer, and Gibson continued to be a pioneer as the next real important phase of guitar development came in with the advent of the electronic pickup. So that's early 1930s, and the pickup really changed things. The first thing it did was it amplified all of the strings in the instrument so the guitar could become a lead voice instead of just a rhythm voice. Now that's not to say there weren't great solo guitarists playing, ripping solos on acoustic instruments, but it was more parlor settings. The Eddie Lang, Joe Venuti era of guitar, they weren't playing with orchestras, they were playing with small groups in small clubs in a much more orchestral setting. This changed all that in the early 1930s, and one of the guy that sort of was the pioneer guitar player at the time was Charlie Christian, of course. So Charlie's rise in fame was directly associated to Gibson figuring out how to amplify these guitars and make them more palatable in a big band setting. 1930s. What else was going on in the 1930s? The Great Depression. So as big bands were shrinking and shedding members and becoming quintets and sextets, and when Benny Goodman's sextet had been the Benny Goodman Orchestra, Charlie Christian all of a sudden had a new role because he could be the rhythm player, the melody player, the harmony player. He could imitate horn lines, and you could hear him because he had an electronic pickup. So entirely new voice to jazz guitar as a result of this pickup, and because now you can hear individual notes, Gibson introduces a cutaway so that you can add an octave of melody that you had no reason to add prior to that. By adding the cutaway, it takes away some of the volume of air for a finer acoustic instrument, but who cares? You gain it back when you get an electronic pickup. So this is kind of the next big era, and the most collectible instruments from that time are the early 1930s. 1934, Gibson Super 400 offered their cutaway for the first time. They called it a premier model, and you could buy it with cutaway and pickup, even though still the standard model was non-cutaway acoustic instrument. That was really when things started to change. And of course, professional musicians saw what Charlie was doing, and they started gravitating towards the same style of instruments. The problem was, as the guitar got more popular and louder and became a leader in bands, feedback started to become an issue. So what was feedback? Well, if you take a really finely carved acoustic instrument, you should be able to touch a string and get that top to vibrate and generate energy into the top. The problem is when you take an electronic pickup and run it through an amplifier, which runs it into a magnet and pushes a piece of cardboard, basically. Now that's regenerating sound waves that are basically the same waves at a much higher volume than the notes you're playing. So as the guitar rose in volume and the bands rose along with the guitar, these frequencies would set in motion the top of the instrument if it wasn't muted, if the strings weren't muted. So play note feeds back through the speaker, it sets the top in motion. Now the energy from the top is pushed back into the bridge. If the bridge isn't restricted, then the string starts to vibrate. The vibration is picked up with the electronic pickup, which is then sent back to the amplifier, which is sent to the speaker, which sends the top into motion again. And so you have this cycle that makes this guitar very susceptible to feedback. So now it's the 1940s and guitars are wildly popular. The most popular act in the United States is a guitar player who also happens to be an innovator and a tinkerer. And anybody want to guess who that was? Les Paul. So Les Paul hit records really loud, and he's trying to find ways to restrict his standard model of guitar from feeding back during performances. And he eventually comes to, a lot of guys are doing all sorts of things to prevent this. This is also kind of the beginning of the bebop era too. So a lot of big band players would play their acoustic rhythm instruments in a big band, and then at night they'd go to these jam sessions and crank up and play bebop, and in order to prevent feedback, they'd put tape over the sound holes, they'd stuff them with bed sheets and pillows. Some guys would blow up balloons to try and restrict the top and the back, and then pop them when they got to their rhythm gigs and blow them up again at night when they were on their later night bebop gigs. Les Paul just decided he didn't really need the acoustic performance value, so he cut off the body of his Gibson guitar, replaced it with a solid piece of wood, mounted the bridge and tailpiece right to the top, and mounted electronic pickups inside of it. And of course, the guitar was awkward and a little bit heavy, and so he reattached the sides of the guitar in order to make it look and feel like the traditional guitar that he had. He called this instrument the Law. This was in the mid-40s. He took the idea of Gibson guitars and said, this is kind of the future of guitar, you need to develop this, and Gibson kicked them out. He said, you know, we don't make broomsticks with strings, we make guitars, we're not into Gibson design. And so Les Paul, you know, went back and continued developing his instrument and a number of other electronic devices that are popular today. In the meantime, another guy realized that, in fact, this was probably the future of guitars. And so he set up a shop, and in order to cut down on manufacturing costs, he didn't see a need to build an instrument and put a block in it. He'd just take a solid piece of wood, mount strings on it, turn it into a mass-produced item. And anybody want to guess who that was? Leo Fender. So 1949, 1950, Leo Fender starts manufacturing in California, and Gibson Guitars realizes Les Paul is probably not as stupid as they thought he was. They call Les Paul back and design what initially was the standard Gibson. They renamed it the Les Paul model once he got the money he was looking for. And by 1952, the most popular guitars on the market and the cheapest guitars on the market and the loudest guitars on the market are Fenders and Gibson solid body electric guitars. So the history and development of jazz guitar goes from about 1922 until 1952, and that's it. While we've changed the way that we build them, manufacturing techniques have improved, there's more consistency today. The basic evolution of the jazz guitar ended at the beginning of the electric guitar. And while modern builders like John Monteleone and other disciples of Jimmy D'Acquisto built very modern works of art, none of them really improved the traditional design of Archtop guitars started by Louis Moore in 1922 and kind of refined in the 1950s by John D'Angelico and guys like that. Any question about any of that stuff? So quickly, there are essentially two ways that these instruments are built. In order to build a fine acoustic guitar, we're using traditional violin materials and construction techniques. So let me start with a tree. So there's a cross section of a tree, there's the bark in the middle, you have the core of the tree, and so this is where the tree starts, and they're really thin and really subject to heat and humidity and bugs and wind, and so they've got to grow pretty fast if they're going to survive. So if you look at the core of a tree, you'll see that there aren't a lot of growth rings until it reaches a certain point where it's strong enough to stand on its own, and then very, very gradually from that point on, as they get older, they grow symmetrically outwards and turn into, hopefully, that they get to grow up and become guitars or violins at some point. But the materials that we're using for this only grow so big, they only grow so tall, they grow in a relatively hilly, rocky environment, typically foothills leading into mountains. So that's really good news. They grow under a little bit of stress. Water's always running off. They're not competing with a lot of other plants like you would see in a rainforest where they're all looking for sunlight and they're all stretching out for water. These trees don't have to compete with a lot of undergrowth. They typically grow in climates where there's a snow cover during the winter, which kills all the little stuff, and during the summer they get to grow at a pretty fast clip because it's warm and often dry summers. Two types of wood are traditional for violins and therefore for Archtop guitars: spruce for the top, maple for the back, sides, and neck. And then all the hardwoods you see on guitars are really dense, non-tone woods, typically either ebony or rosewood. But top, back, sides, spruce and maple traditionally. Spruce is really light, really stiff, grows really straight grain, so you can carve it very thin, and it's stiff enough that it won't collapse under the weight of the strings. And maple is a little bit denser, doesn't vibrate as much. You can carve it really thin, and it projects the sound back out, but adds some warmth and character to the sound of the instrument. Because these trees don't grow particularly wide, you don't make one-piece tops and backs for a traditional jazz guitar. Typical jazz guitars usually measured at the widest point. So this is a 17-inch guitar. The dimension is 17 inches at the width of the lower bow. So these trees aren't wide enough to give you a 17-inch wide piece of wood without wasting most of the tree. So when we harvest the wood for musical instruments like this, we're basically cutting it into quarter-sawn pie-shaped pieces, taking the two pieces that live next to one another on the tree, getting rid of the bark, and getting rid of the really fast-growing center of the tree, and then joining them sort of bark to bark. It's supposed to be symmetrical. So now we have one thick piece of wood from two separate pieces, with the thickest part of the wood being in the center. And from here, we carve it into an arched shape. So that all of this is waste. It's all sawdust. And you wind up with a very thin arched plate from the top and the inverse for the back. If you take a thin piece of wood and bend it into that arch shape, it doesn't give you the same characteristics. So in order to get the proper amount of resonance in an instrument, it's got to be carved from that thicker shape. And because wood is an organic material, you can't just cut down a tree and start carving it. It's got to be dried, and it's got to be properly seasoned and essentially cured for a pretty long period of time in a dry environment, so that there's no sap remaining in the tree that, when you expose it to air, begins to dry quickly. So as a result, these materials have to be cured for a really long time, and they're expensive materials because there's not just tonal aspects, but aesthetic aspects to the quality of the wood you're going to use with the guitar. So typically for a maple back, these two pieces of wood come from a forest somewhere in Europe, although you can use European maple, or you can substitute it with big leaf maple, for example. And the two pieces of spruce come from a forest that's farmed for musical instrument wood, typically European spruce, but you can also use Sitka spruce and other varieties of spruce, and cedar, which is a pretty close wood. You can get similar tonal qualities for that. So you've got to be cut down, and then before we get them, they're air dried for 5 years. And then they ship them to us, and we stick them in a drying room at about 100 degrees, 20% humidity, and we leave them in there for another 5 to 10 years as they're constantly drying. And after about 10 or 15 years, they're entirely dry from inside to outside and cured to the point where when you begin scraping wood off, you're not exposing anything to air that hasn't long been exposed to this very dry air. So you can predict, as you're thinning a top, what the tonal characteristics are going to be as you remove more and more wood. So 2 pieces of wood for a fine jazz guitar or violin, these 2 pieces cost us about $450 to $600. And we have to dry them for the next 5 to 10 years, so we're sitting on that inventory. And then as you begin to carve them, you don't know if somewhere inside of that tree, inside of that piece of wood, is a knot or a wormhole or a sap pocket or a crack that occurred somewhere in the life of the tree. So even after spending your money and curing this for years, you don't necessarily get a fine instrument. And aesthetically,